Samir, I want to talk with you a little bit about the Persian Gulf crisis. I want to do that because you're a man who've tried to update your own knowledge of the region. You know a lot about it, and bring a different perspective to the whole question, it seems to me. I'm interested primarily in this question of the invasion of Iraq, and the UN resolution setting a January 15th deadline, and all of the talk of our administration that we're ready to go to war, the military option. And I really want to argue against that particular option. My own preference is to do it on the basis of what we've commonly called in the Western tradition the just war tradition, criteria set up over the centuries to ask the question about war. The just war tradition is really a methodology, a way of carefully examining all the questions involved in the decision about going to war. It starts out with the presupposition that war is a bad thing, that it hurts people and people die and it destroys property, and therefore you ought to avoid it at all costs. And it forces you to ask questions about whether it makes sense or not. And one of the keys to the whole just war theory is what we call proportionality. That is simply, is the good you're going to accomplish by going to war, which is presumably to save innocent lives or to create a more just situation, will that outweigh the damages, the casualties, the deaths, the destruction of property, the money spent, and so on? And so that's one way of looking at this whole question now of the Persian Gulf. And I think that we might want to try to get this into some context. I mean, it's important for us to understand something about the region, about the possibilities of what's going to happen if we go to war, and so on. So first, I maybe could stop there and just see if you want to comment at all on what I've said up to this point, or whether you want me to set a little more framework here or not. But go ahead.
I agree with everything you've said so far, so why don't you just go ahead?
Okay. Well, then let's start to spell out this whole question of the proportionality. I mean, I know that I've seen figures that I've taken from the Center for Defense Information, and these people, they're former military men, and Center for Defense Information in Washington. It's like a think tank, and former generals and admirals, and they've sketched out a scenario about what they think might happen. And their thing is that it would take about 3 to 4 months for the United States to capture Baghdad, and they would have to eventually do that in order to maintain to gain a military victory. And then they have these kind of figures. They said that this would, out of that 3 months, it would involve approximately 45,000 U.S. casualties with 10,000 deaths. I mean, amazing. 150,000 Iraqi casualties and 35,000 deaths. And 100,000 civilian casualties. The word casualty means wounded and dead together. 100,000, and that's thought of as being the bombing of Baghdad and the major industrial areas, and, well, I don't know how much, civilian areas, I guess. You'd have great civilian casualties here. They're talking about a total cost of the war of approximately $50 billion. Well, now you'll get different figures on this, and one of the problems is the Pentagon has not really released official figures about what they estimate would happen in the war. But the various secretaries of defense and the people knowledgeable in the area have all generally agreed. I mean, you're dealing with a difficult situation here. Now, we're not going to have a few bombing strikes in 3 or 4 days and the war's over. At least that's been the general consensus that I've heard listening to the various reports by the experts. Well, that's pretty heavy.
The cost is horrendous. Yes.
Just remarkable casualties that might well occur in all of this.
If I may interject something over here, while we're talking about loss of life and physical suffering and loss of property, I think very often there is something that we do not account for when we look at war from a distance, and that's what happens to the people who are involved in a war, whether you're talking about people who ended up being victors or those who were vanquished. The emotional crippling which accompanies any war is something which is beyond belief. I haven't experienced that personally, but I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who is a Vietnam veteran, and it was quite an eye-opener to know what has happened to people, to the Vietnam veterans who have returned over here emotionally. It's not just the physical price.
That's a very important point.
It's very important.
And that's the human dimension of all of this.
Yes.
That one has to. And, when you were talking, I was thinking the Soviets experienced the same thing in Afghanistan, and their soldiers returning from there, tremendous emotional problems. And I think there's a heightened consciousness in the modern world because our weaponry is so much more destructive, and the traumas connected with it, and therefore we have this post-Vietnam syndrome that they talk about. Some of our soldiers, coming back, and years later having the flashbacks and the terrible emotional problems. I talked to a chaplain in the Navy who worked at one of the veterans' hospitals, and he told me that some of those people would be in there for years, and he would know them and deal with them, serve them, and they would never trust him. They would not talk to him. They would only talk to another veteran, the only person that they could ever trust to know what the horrendous character of that war was all about. And, so we come out of the Vietnam experience. I don't doubt that colors us the way we, think about war and in our country. Some of the great peacemaker groups now are the veterans groups that say, let's not rush into war. A lot of the military people are the ones who are saying, don't rush into war, because they recognize, I think, not only the statistical cost that I was mentioning, but the human cost that you brought up.
So there really is no such thing as a quick operation. When we talk about a quick war, that really is a misnomer, because the effects will last for a long, long time.
Right, a brutalizing kind of thing. Yeah. You talk about this as well. One of the strongest statements made in the Catholic community at the Second Vatican Council, and said also by Pope John the 23rd before he died in his great encyclical Pacem in Terris, was this idea against indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations. You remember the general who lost his job because he suggested that what would happen in this war is that we would bomb Baghdad.
Right.
And, in the Catholic community, the Catholic bishops have been so strong, that the indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations is a crime against humanity, they've called it. They've spoken out in the strongest terms against that. And that's, again, part of the just war criteria, is to talk about how you would fight a war, and that you can't just, especially with the modern means of destruction, just go out in and obliterate people. Like we would have to speak against the bombing of Dresden, for example, in the Second World War, and say that was, in retrospect, is an immoral action on the part of the United States, or the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So that kind of talk, let's bomb them into the Stone Age and so on, is simply immoral from my moral perspective, and from the Catholic Christian tradition and so on, and from the traditions of many religious groupings. So I think we have to sort of speak out against that when you're looking at these great casualties here.
Agree.
Should we talk a little bit, Samir, about what we're hoping to accomplish? Because, when you get down to it, the President has offered, a lot of reasons of why we ought to be going about all of this. He says that, we're trying to free Kuwait. We're going to try to halt the atrocities that are going on there. We're trying to preserve, and then I think we get to the important one, preserve the international economic order, because, surely that's a big factor in all of this. The argument is said, well, the United States didn't feel the need to go in and defend other groups when they were attacked, but in this case we do, because our own interests are greatly at stake. We all know that. The Middle East oil is a major factor in this. I wonder if you want to address that a little bit, about this the international economic order, and what we think is at stake in terms of our own interests, and maybe how the Middle East sees that oil question. You want to say something about that?
Well, according to President Bush, I believe when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the first reason he gave for resisting that aggression was that we need to keep our lifestyle.
Yeah,
I'm
that's right.
probably paraphrasing
Well, but that was the idea. It's an
nonetheless,
attack on our lifestyle.
It's an attack on
Later
our
on,
lifestyle.
Senator Baker said it was jobs. It came down to a question of jobs.
Secretary Baker said it's jobs, and now we, of course, want to restrict Saddam Hussein's power. That's another criterion that developed
and
later
especially
on,
if he got nuclear weapons.
Especially if he got nuclear weapons, and that's another perceived threat. So it's interesting that we don't have any clear objectives as a government, it seems to me. Nonetheless, we do feel that the industrialized Western nations have been dependent on inexpensive oil from the Middle East, and that's a fact of life. And it seems to me that the Middle Eastern oil-producing countries need to sell that oil. So it's really a matter of supply and demand. The supply has not been interrupted since the Iraqi invasion, and that's a good sign. And it seems to me there are other ways of working out an agreement between the oil producers and the oil consumers other than going to war. So I really...
Based on an economic analysis that says they've got the oil, they need to sell it, and we need it.
We need it.
So sooner or later someone's going to sell it. I mean, however you work it out.
Absolutely. Now, in terms of what happens to the region following the invasion, whether the sanctions work, and let's hope they do, and the problem is solved peacefully, or whether there's war, and I hope that doesn't happen, I think our relationship with the countries of the Middle East, in particular with the Arab countries, is going to be changed. As an interesting footnote here, let me add that the Arabs in general are pretty sophisticated when it comes to looking at American foreign policy and divorcing it from the American people. A friend of mine who returned from Baghdad, she was in Baghdad with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. She talked to a lot of Iraqis there, and none of them seemed to suggest that they had any ill feelings towards the American people as such. What they think is that American foreign policy is misguided. And that's interesting, because I wished that we in the United States looked at the Iraqi people or the Kuwaiti people or the Saudis as being human. Very often we stereotype and dehumanize these people to the point where, as one writer put it, the Arabs are looked upon as belonging to one of two types. They're either the stooges who do what we want them to do, such as the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Kuwaitis, or the terrorists, which is everybody else. Now, it seems
Samir, while
to
you're
me,
on it, I just wanted to, one of the points that I in trying to make that, solidify that, I was trying to make the point that the Iraqi soldiers, we should have a certain empathy for them. I mean, if I've got the power structure right, I mean, they're under a cruel dictator, and they are in a coerced position, and they often don't have a lot of choices, and we keep hearing these things about commanders who opposed the invasion of Kuwait on the part of Iraq being executed, etc. We should have an empathy for the common Iraqi soldier. I mean, he's not a person who's going around and wanting to, ruin the world or something. He's in a system. We should be able to understand that. He's in a system of, it's an oppressive state that he lives in. And I think that might help us to say, not just to say, well, so what? So there's going to be 35,000 Iraqi soldiers killed. I mean, it's not a so what. I mean, they're human beings.
They're people too.
And they're people who live in a particular political system, which doesn't really give them a vote to say whether they want to go to war or not. So anyway, I just thought I wanted to put another human face on the point you're making there.
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. The perception of American foreign policy in the Middle East has been that it is a continuation of the colonial legacy, although the United States is new to the region.
Because it was a British-French
because
business.
of the British-French business. You're absolutely right. Nonetheless, you hear a lot of grumbling from the Middle East about America having a double standard in the Middle East. In other words, when an Arab leader or an Arab country does something wrong, the invasion of Kuwait is an example of what's wrong, then the United States says this is absolutely not permissible. However, they look at other situations in recent history, such as the United States is still in Panama. We still have, I heard last week on the news that we still have about 10,000 troops in Panama City. Okay, how will the future of the Arab world be shaped up following this incident is an interesting question to
Well, it
ask.
is. I mean, suppose we do go in and attack. You know, one of the other criteria, Samir, for the just war used by the just war tradition is that there must be a probability of success when you go to war. And so the question becomes, what do you mean by success in this case? Now,
Right.
I think that many people, other than I once heard Senator Monahan say we couldn't win this war, but I mean, most people believe we would win the war eventually, that through superior air power and our resources and wearing down the enemy, we would eventually be able to capture Baghdad as the symbol of the fall of the Iraqi regime, so that eventually we would win the war. But my question is, what is success? I mean, what do you have after you achieve that? Presumably you get rid of Saddam Hussein, but you now have a whole new situation in the Middle East. You have the question of how we relate to the Arab world as a whole, it seems to me. What will it mean to the Kurdish people inside of Iraq? That might be a chance for liberation for them. How much power will Syria get? What about Iran, which is flows from the Persian Empire of old and must always be distinguished, if I'm correct, from the other nations there in that area, right?
Right.
So I mean, does Iran, which is 3 times the population of Iraq, and is still ruled by the fundamentalist Islamic rulers, what new power will they have, and what new threat will they be to us in the Middle East? So those are the kind of questions that would come to my mind when you begin to ask success. I mean, it's not just that you would destroy the Iraqi military machine. You got a longer range question here. I have another question about the United Nations in relationship to that, but why don't we just stay with this one for a while? What shape our relationships with the Arab world would be in. I mean, I just, as a layman, say, I think the Arabs are going to be very unhappy, and I could see them 50 years from now pointing to the Americans. There's the ones that killed 100,000 Iraqis in capturing Baghdad.
I think you're absolutely right. And even if we manage to get rid of Saddam Hussein is the product of a certain socio-historical political context, and he's not a unique phenomenon. So I think, to personalize it in this way, the way President Bush seems to be doing, I think is the wrong way to go about it. But how would our relationships with the Arab world be shaped up? I think that's a key question. So far, the United States foreign policy has been perceived by the masses and intellectuals alike as the kind of policy that would keep reactionary regimes in power as long as these regimes cooperated in supplying the oil that we need.
Like the Saudi regime.
Like the Saudis. You're absolutely right.
Or our support of the Shah in Iran.
And support of the Shah in Iran. And
the support of the Kuwaiti government, too.
Absolutely. And
which is like a feudal government, right? I mean, run by a family.
Absolutely. In Kuwait, there was a parliament that was suspended in 1986. So, in other words, it is a monarchy, it's an emirate, actually, or a sheikdom. However, it is absolute rule. I mean, there is no democracy over there. This is going to seem to the Arab world as another attempt by the United States to suppress any nationalistic movements in the region and to keep the status quo in terms of our interest in oil. Here's one man who seems, according to his followers, to have developed Iraq into a more democratic type of government than the traditional monarchies or sheikdoms. In other words, there are other people involved in the decision-making process, and they feel that he has done well in terms of education and distributing.
Would this be a widespread impression? Are you saying within Iraq or within the Arab world as a whole?
Within the Arab world as a whole. Besides, this is the one man who in recent history has managed to stand up to the colonial powers. Mm-hmm. And so they applaud him. Right? So there are two sides to Saddam Hussein.
And one must see this in terms of understanding the Arab mentality, right? Because, I mean, they still have that sense that they're in an adversarial position with the West. They've seen themselves as looked down upon, felt the inferior partner in this dialogue, and have been subject to colonialism and so on. And their feeling is somehow you must stand up against the West. I suppose that's what Khomeini really relied on as well, the evil empire in the United States, and always using them as the whipping boy, and they're the ones that we have to be against. The great Satan really turns out in their mind to be the United States.
Yes.
So we need to know that, don't we, to understand their mentality.
Absolutely, you're right. So the Middle East may never be the same again. And how things will shape up in the future would be a very interesting thing to pay attention to.
One of the questions, again, from a moral perspective, you'd have to say, by what right do we have a claim upon Middle East oil and at a cheap price? And as one author said, we don't have a divine right to Middle East oil. I mean, we're sitting over in the United States, 6% of the world's population consuming, I don't know the numbers, 30% of the oil resources, something like that. We have to ask ourselves, we sort of start out with the premise, well, we've got a right to that. We'd have to ask ourselves, on what basis do we say we have a right to that? And I think the moral argument is we don't. We don't have a right to that. We can enter in contractual agreements, economic agreements, with the people who do own the oil in the Middle East, and supposedly that's how the international economy would work. But that idea that we can go in and throw our weight around or go to war for oil is not a morally legitimate argument. What it suggests, I mean, if you want to look at a bigger picture here, seems to me what it suggests is a greater conservation in the United States. We're always going to be in this situation with the Middle East. There's not some right-wing government might be against us. At any point in the Middle East, governments could rise that say for one reason or another they want to up the prices or shut off the supply for a while or whatever. We'll always be dependent. I think it points back to us finding alternate energy sources of conserving and reducing our dependency on Middle East oil. And instead we're going in the other direction. We get more dependent upon it seems.
It's an interdependent world, and certainly we depend on oil from the Middle East. Not as much as many other countries do.
Yeah, but Japan and West Germany, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, prime users.
But remember that Middle Eastern countries and third world countries in general depend on us. They have to buy our goods. And so this interdependency, it seems to me, argues very strongly for solving problems peacefully instead of going to war, simply because there are certain claims that we think are the right claims.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it suggests, I thought you made a very good point about negotiations and the need to discuss these matters, and that the whole idea of sort of a comprehensive solution to the Middle East questions. One's impression is that maybe our foreign policy there has been driven by faulty criteria. I mean, here we were supporting Iraq all the way through an 8-year war with Iran, and now suddenly we find ourselves in a position of having to fight against people who we supplied for 8 years. I mean, that suggests a sort of short-sighted policy there.
Right.
And again, I would fear very greatly this situation in the future, where the Arab world might well look upon us, have more reasons to sow hatred in this relationship. And we've had enough problems over the years with crusades and questions like that, and now we've got maybe one more thing. And I think economic sanctions are one thing. We get the support of the Arab world there, but invasion, they've all said no. The Egyptians are not going to fight in that war to invade Iraq.
Right.
Nor are the Syrians.
You're right. You're right. It seems to be the United States government, the British government, and the Israeli government who are really asking for the invasion. Of course, Saudi Arabia and the Kuwaitis who want their country liberated, therefore.
And the Saudis who greatly fear the power of Iraq, obviously.
Yes, they do.
That's very real.
Sure.
Well, Samir, maybe if I can try to pull this together in some ways. I had a thesis going here, and which we've been talking about. That is that I don't think we should invade Iraq, that we should give the sanctions time to work. And we've been trying to analyze that from various viewpoints. And I've tried to bring out, the great casualties, however you count them. I mean, there's tremendous casualties involved, and there's a great human cost. And I thought you made a great point about the brutalizing that often occurs through war and the emotional scars that are carried with it. So that has to weigh in. Now, the just war tradition says is the good you're going to gain here, that is the right to use this oil, the liberation of Kuwait and the fall of Saddam Hussein, those are the goals that we're talking about here. Do they outweigh that destruction? My opinion would be no, they don't, and that therefore an invasion would be immoral at this point. And again, I'm looking to sell that idea. I think it's important for people to speak out on this question, to think it through, and to make their voices heard in this period that we really do have now to influence public opinion and our administration.